Fixate on Code, episode 17. All right, Larry Buerta here, and you are listening to Fixate on Code, the weekly bite-sized podcast where I talk to the best devs about their favorite strategies for writing great code. Now, let's chat with today's featured guest, Jake Archibald. Jake, thanks for joining me today.
No problem. How's it going?
Awesome on this side, thank you. Jake is a developer advocate for Google Chrome, where he speaks regularly about service worker, application performance, and offline-first apps. Before joining the team at Google, Jake worked at Lanyrd honing his performance skills, and before that worked at the BBC creating an inclusive experience for users with disabilities. Jake, can you fill in some of the gaps in that intro and tell me a little bit about what you get up to when you are not writing code?
Oh, okay. The gaps of that. I mean, there aren't many. So I ended up at the BBC pretty much straight after university. I guess I spent most of my time doing like a JavaScript library there, which kind of involved UI components, where a lot of the accessibility stuff came in. But yeah, I left the BBC, went to an agency. I actually really enjoyed agency work. I think I was lucky. I think I was working for a good agency. And then the Lanyrd thing, a lot of web performance stuff, but also that is where, because we wanted Lanyrd to work offline because of conference Wi-Fi being bad, but also people like roaming because they're in another country. And that's really where the whole sort of journey of doing stuff offline first, that's where all of that began. That's where I found out that app cache was not suitable for what we were trying to do. And then I ended up at Google trying to fix it, and hopefully we got somewhere with it.
How long ago were you at Lanyrd trying to work on offline stuff?
I've been at Google for 5 years now, which kind of makes me feel really old. And then it was immediately before that I was at Lanyrd, and I was there for a year.
So that's 2012, and you're trying to work with offline apps back then, and it's only recently become a sort of mainstream thing, but you must have been fighting a massive uphill battle back then.
Yeah, and that's where the whole I wrote this article called "App Cache is a Douchebag," which was kind of it was partially a rant of like, why is this API? How did this API end up getting into browsers? Like there was, I guess they just didn't think beyond one very narrow use case. But the article was also about kind of how you can sort of try and work around most of it a little bit, kind of, to actually make something that sort of that worked. So yeah, it was, and that was sort of my introduction to reading web specs as well, because there were articles about app cache at the time, but most of the articles were like, oh yeah, you just like you put stuff in this manifest and as if by magic everything now works offline. But it's kind of like, well, but when is this actually updating? Like, why is it doing this? And it's doing lots of things that aren't covered in any of these articles. So the only source I really had was the spec, and it was tough. I guess I've been working with web standards enough now that I can I sort of know how they're written. I know how to click around them. But yeah, trying to chew through what was the HTML spec, but the app cache specific parts of that to try and figure out when all of these things actually happen and which requests will be handled by app cache and which ones won't be. Yeah, that was a kind of real learning curve that I hit face on, really.
So you've worked a ton with Service Worker. You speak a lot about Service Worker, and I think a lot of people associate your name with Service Worker as well. What are you most passionate about as a developer?
Well, the web platform in general, right? It's thinking of like the promise of things like Java as being this kind of write once, run everywhere thing, and the idea that we'd be building apps with Java, and that side of it never really happened in a big way. And it feels like the web managed it, it's that true experience of, you can write it once and it's running on OS X, running on Windows, it's running on Android and lots of obscure operating systems as well, on phones, on tablets. And that's what I really love about the web platform. And being able to just send someone a URL from one device to another, and they can experience the app without any kind of install step, and without too many compatibility worries. That sort of openness is what I love.
And then us being able to extend that now with progressive web apps, which are super exciting and I think really going to give native apps a massive run for their money, which is super exciting because I suppose we're writing once and running everywhere.
I was going to say with that, like, I find it really exciting going to conferences or I was in India last week and just hearing people talking about progressive web apps, especially building them instead of native apps. And part of me sort of steps back and thinks that the term PWA, progressive web app, me from 10 years ago would have probably hated that. Because I hated Ajax. And because it annoyed me because it's like, hey, what Ajax? What does it mean? You know, it's like asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Like, but everyone's using this phrase to mean things that aren't XML or things like that. And I was like, it's making me angry because it's just this is a marketing phrase. It's really annoying. But then I look back now and the term Ajax, it was something that the people who had funding, like the managers or the people creating projects were saying, hey, can you make this is it going to be Ajax or is it going to be Web 2.0? And it kind of became this marketing term for, is it going to be good? Is it going to be good and modern? Yeah. And I think that is what PWA is. And I've made my peace with that. But it also makes me happy that we do have things like Lighthouse as a way to kind of get a tangible feel for what PWA is and what the requirements are. But yeah, it just means building a modern website that works offline and runs everywhere.
How is the response in India? Because as an emerging market, data is a massive concern to them. It's the same here in Africa. And I imagine there's many other countries around the world where data and speed are a huge factor that people in first world countries in the US and the UK and Europe, they often don't think about. They don't know it's a problem. How is the response in India to this alternative to building native applications?
Yeah, so I was in Bangalore a couple of years ago, and we talked to a lot of dev teams out there, and most of them were running, they were building for mobile, and they were using Angular 1. And it kind of blew my mind because it's like, Angular 1, I have a reputation for being anti-framework, and a lot of that is sort of, I'm softening a lot because frameworks are getting better. But Angular 1 was terrible. It is not suitable for mobile at all. Even on a high-end phone, it was slow. So I was sort of shocked to see these teams, like, because Angular was massive as well. It's so massive and slow. And it's just like, this is the least suitable thing to be running in India, Yeah. So going back now and hearing, oh yeah, we're using Preact because it's small, and we're doing server rendering because it's fast and good for SEO or whatever. So just seeing that difference in a couple of years has been amazing. At the conference, I ran this. We did this thing called a site clinic, which was just me and a few other DevRels sort of standing at a table. People would bring their URLs, and we would do like a little performance audit and see where things were. And the results were as mixed as they would be anywhere. We would catch the odd case of asynchronous XHR happening, or maybe like scripts which were blocking rendering. But then I saw some folks bringing sites that I had very little to say about other than well done. And I spoke to one guy in particular, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, I build sites for the US, but I build them as if I were building them for my village in India."
Wow.
And the result is I build these sites that work really, really fast in the US. And that was great to hear. And I was kind of like, I want to bring some UK and US dev teams to Bangalore to speak to the teams there and say, like, learn from them, like the tactics they're using to make stuff run really fast. Because they've really got a handle on it.
I suppose what you need there is the opposite mentality from the UK and the US, that I'm building a site for clients in the US or an application, but I'm building it as if my clients or end users are sitting in India.
Exactly. And the term, the kind of phrasing we use for promoting offline first, we'll tend to use things like, it's going to work when someone is traveling and they're roaming, because you get, either no or slow data then, or you get, you're on a plane where you have no data, or you're on a train where you're going in and out of bad data, but these are very sort of privileged use cases. Not everyone. Very few people are traveling the world. But not everyone's sort of commuting on a train every day as well.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of use cases that we can give that are more applicable to the people who have the money as well. Because if you're sort of saying, think about people in more rural areas that don't have great internet. An executive sitting in an office in London might not find that relatable. So we find we have more success with, imagine if this was more usable during your commute through Sussex,
Something I suppose tangible and relatable to people who, I suppose it comes down to being privileged and disconnected, I suppose, in a way. Now, Jake, you've worked at BBC, you've worked at Lanyrd, and now you're a developer advocate at Google Chrome. Can you tell me what are the steps that got you to where you are today?
Luck, and being in the right place at the right time. I saw this tweet a few weeks ago where it just said, entrepreneurs giving advice. Here are the numbers I used to win the lottery. And that really resonated with me. But, for what it's worth, here are the numbers that I picked. I went to university in Middlesbrough, which is not one of the top universities by any stretch. But I did a course in multimedia there, which was predominantly Flash. There was a bit of web stuff there, but I was a kind of, I trained as a Flash developer, I guess, and it was something I was kind of dabbling in before I went to university as well. But the key part of that course for me was there was this year in industry, and you organized it mostly yourself. Found somewhere to go for the third year. It was a 4-year course. And I wound up at Reuters in London. And that really was that taught me how to work for a company and in an office, and also communicate to less technical people, because I was working in HR doing their intranet. Also their careers website externally, but it was mostly intranet stuff. But once I'd gone back to university, finished that course, Reuters offered me a job there. So that kind of got me down to London, because I wouldn't have chanced it just moving if I didn't have a job there. But I was keen on doing stuff with other developers, because I was kind of, at Reuters, because I was in this HR team, we had this internal job board that they wanted. And so they told me what they wanted, and I designed it and put it together. And the stack that they had there was really old, but I managed to sort of write this weird thing in Perl that would kind of scraped the data from the main site and a couple of other sites and put it in a database, and I optimized that and put it together. I was really pleased with it, and I showed them it, and it was like, and they were like, "Oh yeah, this is great. Thanks, Jake." And then it was like two days later, they went, Jake, we've got these new mice and we don't know how to plug them in. Could you do that?" And I did that, and they were like, "Oh, that was great. Thanks, Jake." And I was like, "Oh, wait, that's the same reward I got for this crazy Perl thing." I was like, "Oh, maybe this is not the right place for me." So, and that's when I went to the BBC. And so I did 4 years there, learned a lot about accessibility. They did this JavaScript library that was used internally there for a long time. I think some sites still use it. But yeah, that got me talking to other developers, which I didn't really have at Reuters. That got me started speaking at small meetups and things like that. That's when I did my first conference talk. One of the developers there, her partner ran the App Media Conference, which was a conference many years ago. And because I knew him through her, he invited me at this conference. I spoke at that, and that was kind of my big break, because it was, I was speaking about the JavaScript library we did at the BBC and kind of the challenges of writing JavaScript at the BBC, because we had to support more browsers than other people did, and had stronger accessibility guidelines as well. But that was at the same conference. Brendan Eich was speaking, Yehuda Katz was speaking, Dion Alma was speaking, and this is kind of like people who I really looked up to at the time when I was kind of giving my first conference talk at the same stage. And yeah, I think it was the following year, Remy Sharp got me to speak at Full Frontal, his conference in Brighton. And that's kind of, the conference speaking thing sort of built up from there. But then at the BBC, some management structures changed. There was a reorg. My project got canned, which, I mean, it was bad at the time, but it was really, looking after that project was the only thing keeping me at the BBC. I'd been there for 4 years, and sort of being young at the time, it kind of felt like a long time to be in one place. So I went to an agency called The Team with Phil Hawksworth, who's now at Netlify. But I really enjoyed the BBC when we were making websites for TV shows, because there was this kind of quick turnaround, so tight deadlines, but variety. And I kind of found that again at this agency, sort of doing lots of different stuff, testing different ways of building things. Because I know if I do the wrong thing, then I know this project's over in 1 month, and I can start the new one and make a different set of mistakes on the new one. But yeah, Simon and Natalie, who were sort of starting up Lanyrd, they and I'd met them at conferences and at meetups. Yeah, they invited me to join Lanyrd, and yeah, like I said before, this is where we wanted to do this offline thing, and so that's kind of where I learned all about web standards. That's how I learned that the offline situation we had wasn't great. But I had to say, I was kind of like, startup life wasn't really for me, and working on just one project for a long time, I wasn't so comfortable with that. So I looked to move to a different agency where Phil, who I worked with, who was my boss at the agency before, he'd moved on, and I was kind of saying to him, "Hey, hire me, let's work together again." That worked out great. But at the same time, I was contacted by Paul Kinlan at Google, saying that, they were just making this new thing called a Chromebook, and they were wanting developer feedback on it. So, I did that, and I came back to the Google office to give them the Chromebook back, along with all the feedback that I'd gathered. And some of the US folks were over in the office at the time for some reason. So I was like, Paul Irish, Eric Beidelman were there. So I went out for dinner with them. I was saying, yeah, I'm going to move on, I think. I've got, it's trying to set up this thing with this agency. And they were like, do you want to interview with us? Do you fancy giving that a go?
Wow.
And I'd heard about these terrifying Google interviews,
Yeah.
But I was kind of like, well, yeah, okay, why not? I've got nothing to lose. If we can set it up quickly, because I've got this offer sort of building with this other place.
Yeah.
And I really did go into it thinking, I'm probably not going to get this, but it's no big deal, because I'm kind of building up this idea with this agency that I would be pretty happy with.
Mm-hmm.
And I only managed to sneak in. I managed to get past the interview at Google, which still kind of amazes me. I don't have a computer science background. Like I say, it's sort of multimedia and Flash. Yeah. And then once I got in, they were like, hey, that offline thing you've been complaining about so much. Why not go fix it? I was like, no, I'm just the problems guy. I'm not the solutions guy.
I can point them out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yeah, I guess that's my life history, really.
Wow, that's a crazy story. Now, I mean, you've spent your time at a range of different companies. I'm sure you've seen your fair amount of ups and downs. What is the worst experience you've ever had on a project?
Yeah. I mean, I would say in general, I've been quite lucky. I haven't had too many bad experiences. I gave a really bad talk once at Event Apart, which was a bit miserable because Event Apart, that's Jeffrey Zeldman, Eric Meyer, like sort of big names.
It's a big thing,
right? And I'd written this talk where that was an interactive quiz. As I did the big web quiz thing at I/O earlier this year, but many years before that, I did this sort of prototype of that, which is a similar thing, people voting on their phones. And the questions were all about like which browsers are going to make a request in this situation. And I'd given this talk at a couple of meetups, and it felt great because people were groaning at the answers, they were competing with each other. It was a really nice talk to give, and I'd given it a few times, and I hadn't gotten bored of it. Anyway, I went to Event Apart thinking like, oh well, this is going to go great, and the network failed. Like people couldn't connect to the server to do the interactive
conference Wi-Fi.
Right, exactly. So with the interactive part gone, like I had to sort of do a show of hands instead of the interactive thing. And people are not up for that. Like 4 questions in, people are like, nah, mate, my arm's tired. I'm just not playing anymore. And it's just that horrible thing of I have lost this audience like 10 minutes in, and it's a 50-minute talk.
50?
Yeah, they run the talks long at event apart, or at least they did back then. They haven't invited me back since then, so... but in terms of like actual projects, aside from speaking, this JavaScript library we ran at the BBC, the way we deployed it, and the way a lot of stuff at the BBC was deployed, was using FTP, like not secure FTP, just FTP drag and drop.
Wow.
And shared password, and I had the keys to the castle, along with God only knows how many people.
How much of the application was exposed through that one FTP account?
Well, it was a JavaScript library, so it was the whole thing. We were just dragging and dropping the thing into a root folder on the BBC web server. And the way we would do it, because we did a lot of testing, because we knew what the stakes were. Yeah. But we would always, do the testing, but then we'd do all the minification, do some testing there, and then we do what we called a silent release. Every time we said silent release, I would giggle because I have the humor of a 12-year-old. But then, so we did this, and everything seemed great. We checked all of the BBC sites, everything was fine, not a problem. And it turns out the way this deployment system happened under the hood, and I didn't know this at the time, but you FTP'd and it went to this sort of central place. But the BBC was actually, built of a load of front-end servers that would synchronize with each other. And apparently what had happened is the deploy hadn't quite gone right. It had only gone to one server that was not part of the cluster. So our deploy hadn't really happened. And what happened is about 2 weeks later, the cluster was fixed or reset or something. And this server that we'd actually deployed to came back into the cluster and went, hey, I've got this newer thing that none of you have. How about we all synchronize up on that a little bit? And it turns out there was like a minification bug that had crept in, and it was like 8:30 at night on a weekday. We broke iPlayer, the video streaming thing that was just gaining huge popularity at the BBC.
Oh, jeez.
So, that was a kind of, emergency phone calls happening, having to get back into the office to sort of figure out how to fix this, like what was happening. And we lost a lot of trust with the head of iPlayer at the time. Even though, we were saying this is not our fault. We really felt like BBC's deployment system screwed us over. But anyway, it was a kind of to bring down something as big as iPlayer for a few hours, and it was only a few hours, but at a prime time, it was something we definitely had to recover from.
That's quite a nightmare to be in the middle of. Now, in terms of getting quality work done on a daily basis, Jake, which method or tool are you using that you'd hate to be without?
Electricity. I don't know, the internet. I use Chrome a lot. That's
really,
yeah. Seriously. I don't know. Like, I don't feel like particularly religious about tooling or stuck to any one thing. I like Visual Studio Code, it's an editor. It's just an editor. If it disappeared tomorrow, I'd go to another editor. My life wouldn't be in ruins.
I've heard a lot of really good news. I mean, what's his name? Sean Larkin is a big advocate of it.
Well, he works at Microsoft now, so he has to say that.
And Chris Haleman as well, who's also working at Microsoft. But I've seen a lot of guys. I know Adi Osmani, I think, was recently speaking about, or am I wrong? But I've seen a lot of guys really, really taking on a lot of people switching from Atom to VS Code, and it seems to be quite a step up. I mean, I've given it a brief bash myself. I'm a bit stuck in my Vim ways, and I can't get all of my Vim sort of niceties into VS Code. I think my brain sparks an electric spark every time I touch my mouse.
Well, I would say if you're using Vim, then you're already kind of more advanced than things like Atom and VS Code can offer you, right? I'm not a Vim user, so I kind of like the stuff that VS Code has, especially the auto-completion, especially if you're using things like TypeScript. But like I say, if it disappeared tomorrow, I would, go back to Sublime or something else. It's not a big deal. I guess the thing that if it did disappear tomorrow, that I would be lost without is GitHub. Because all of the standards work I do, a lot of my day is spent on GitHub issues because we do that now instead of mailing lists, which is much better. If Chrome DevTools disappeared, I'd be a bit lost, but I don't know. Again, Firefox DevTools are pretty good. So, it's just trying to think of things that if it disappeared, what would I be totally lost without? I guess GitHub is probably it, because, huge amounts of conversation and organization would have to move somewhere else, and I'm not really sure what the alternatives are right now.
And it's interesting what originally started as a software collaboration platform is now much more than that. I mean, it's used for communication, it's used for project management, and all these things that I imagine the people at GitHub they didn't even imagine would be use cases for it. And without even massive changes on their side, they still continue to develop GitHub, focused on software developers, but as an organization, you can still benefit massively from it. Now, Jake, in your daily work, where do you still get frustrated? Where do you feel there's room for things to be done in a more effective way?
I would guess it feels right now that there's a real disconnect between developers and standards authors. Like that, it can feel like two camps where, I don't know, there's this perception that developers think standards folks are these like academics who have no idea how the real world works, and that's why they make all of these stupid decisions. And I think developers also feel that standards folks see them as kind of children who are excited about whatever the latest fad is, and put jQuery in the platform, put React in the platform, just do it by magic. And I've been on both sides of that, and I continue to be on both sides of that, as a web developer, but also as working on a working group on various web standards. And I think back to when I wrote AppCache is a douchebag, that kind of the big piece on why AppCache is rubbish. And I remember at the time, I didn't really think of the humans who implemented that and who specified it, because I kind of felt really detached from it. Like I thought of them in the same way I thought of politicians, like I know who the politicians are, but I don't really think of them as human. They're just they're just these people who are out of touch, and they're deciding things that will affect my life behind closed doors, and I don't know really how any of it works. Being part of a working group now, I kind of see the amount of research that goes into this stuff, and the amount of respect these folks have for developers, and the number of them who are also developers. But I have also been involved in working groups that do feel like a bunch of academics wasting time. So this is the part where I don't really have any answers, but I would like to see the divide between standards and developers sort of broken down. I think the WhatWG has done an excellent job here in opening things out, putting things on GitHub, not requiring people to pay membership in order to be involved, switching to GitHub rather than mailing lists, because I just ignore the mailing list now. I don't find them productive. I find GitHub much easier to interact with, and it seems to be where we get more interaction from developers as well. The W3 has the YCG as a kind of similar effort to get developers involved. Yeah, I think that's been a big step forward. I hear some standards folks sort of saying to web developers, hey, you should get involved more. I don't know. I think it's so rare for people to have enough spare time to get involved in a meaningful way. I only got involved really when I was being paid to, or my job was giving me enough free time or enough time to take part in it. So I really empathize with developers who've kind of went to web standards and said, hey, why don't we do this? And the response has been, well, how does that work? I would say most developers are going to hit a brick wall at that point, because reading specs is hard. There's not really a lot of documentation for how specs work, which I think, working on these things for a couple of years now, I'm only starting to get a handle of the, how the language we need to use to define, when we create a JavaScript object, which thread is that created on, like which event loop does that go into, which JavaScript realm does that appear in, all of this sort of stuff, which I just hadn't ever considered when I was not doing standards work. So yeah, no real answers there, but I would love to see that go away by magic.
Well, being part of these working groups, you're working with new technologies and discussing a lot of them. Are there any new libraries or frameworks or even just personal projects, I suppose, that you're really excited about at the moment?
So I was at TPAC last month, which is the big W3C meetup, where you get a lot of the browser vendors there, and also a lot of representatives from Facebook and teams like that. Ryosuke, who works on Safari, he presented this idea called template instantiation, and I'm really excited about that. It's this idea that you have a template tag, which we already have today, but a special way to use mustache-like templating inside that template tag.
Oh, wow.
And you can so then you would say, with this template, actually create me DOM nodes from this. And you pass in like an object to fill in the blanks, to fill in like the mustache-like blanks. But then you would also have like a set state method to update all of those at once. And I really like this idea because it's taking the sort of stuff we see in React and we see in Hyper HTML and Lit HTML, a lot of libraries, and it sort of says okay, so let's come up with a higher level but also still low level enough way to kind of enable a lot of these technologies to be faster. How can we bring this into the platform? And I'm kind of excited about that because VDOM is really interesting, but I'm pretty confident it's a means to an end. I think the VDOM thing is just a way of sort of specifying all of this state, and but the diffing step that has to happen in order to update the DOM kind of shows that something isn't quite right. It's having to work around what's there. Whereas I think this template instantiation thing, which is taking a lot of cues from Hyper HTML, Lit HTML, of how you can do those updates without the overhead of diffing, I'm really excited about that. I'm keen to see that proposal move forward, and it's great to see Mozilla and Google sort of go, yes, we are interested in helping with this proposal and seeing what we can build out of it and seeing how we can fix the problems with it.
It's interesting how these frameworks can sort of enlighten us on problems that we took for granted before, that we didn't really see were problems, and now React comes out. Well, I suppose React isn't responsible for VDOM. I suppose they're responsible for how many people know about it now. But it's interesting how that's now an identified issue that can be solved with a native API, which is that's super exciting.
Right
now, Jake, with all of these new languages and specs and libraries that are coming out, how do you decide on what to learn, and when do you make time to learn?
So I am usually late to the party when it comes to libraries and frameworks. I keep up to date with web standards and browser features. So I guess I pick my battles. So in terms of web standards, through the things like intent to ship, but also just the issues on the HTML spec, the discussions in the YCG. I keep quite up to date with specs as they progress, ideas as they're proposed. But obviously working here, I've also built up relationships with engineers in storage, and I meet up with them at various events, and also standard things like TPAC. So that's kind of how I keep up to date with standards. But yeah, with libraries, I kind of sit back and wait until they're popular. I don't have time to experiment with all the frameworks, so I'll wait and go, okay, so React and Vue and Angular are popular. I could look at those three. But yes, I'm definitely not at the bleeding edge of that stuff. I've got a finite amount of time, and I guess in terms of keeping up, I spend that effort on standards rather than libraries.
Yeah, and everything that comes out is so transient as well. I suppose Angular 1 was the flavor of about 2011, 2012, and Angular 1 went right out the door. And I suppose Angular, what do you call it now? Angular X? Angular XXXX. I don't know how many Angulars are coming out now.
Oh my God. One was called Angular.js and one was just called Angular. And one of them's the new one and one of them's the old one. I think maybe Angular is the new one, but it's a 50-50 chance. Yeah, I can't remember what the naming scheme is.
All right. So, Jake, which specific aspect about programming has dramatically changed the way that you think about and write code?
I guess it's a little bit like we were talking before. When people think of React, they think of VDOM and the diffing, but yeah, I do think it's just a means to an end. For me, the interesting part of React is the state and props model, and the life cycle of the components. And I'm really interested in the scheduling stuff that they're starting to introduce, like the sort of the async stuff, but also the single direction data binding. That was something using other frameworks that I really struggled with. Is like the two-way data binding thing never sat well with me. It seemed to really confuse the data flow. So seeing React come in with this very well-defined single direction for binding, but then to communicate back up, you're changing props. Even when I'm not using React or Preact, it's a model that a pattern that I find myself following. And I have this sort of little bet with myself that in a few years, maybe 5 years, will React even be using VDOM anymore? because I don't think it's the key part of React. I think React will survive beyond VDOM.
Oh, that's cool. That's super exciting. And I mean, working with bidirectional state or bidirectional events in Angular 1 was a nightmare. I imagine a lot of that has been cleaned up in the newer Angulars. But it was a bit of a mind shift changing to React with that unidirectional data flow. But yeah, I agree completely. When it comes to working with data and to update your component where you are, it's responsible for being updated somewhere higher up in the tree, and it goes in this beautiful circle. Yeah, I don't know how to describe it. It's a beautiful way of thinking, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And with that, we've come to the end of our first segment. Jake, I'm about to throw some quick fire questions your way. Let's do this.
All right.
What is the best advice about programming you have ever received?
It wasn't about programming, but at school, my art teacher said, you get better at painting with every painting you paint. I didn't manage to get very good at painting, but I appreciated the sentiment. And I do think that's true, is like everything you build, every little library you write, everything you experiment with, it's not wasted time. Even if the project doesn't take off, or if you just sort of, hit Command A, delete straight afterwards, it would have still improved you as a coder.
Which personal habits do you attribute to writing better code?
I don't have any. It's entirely the other way around. Coding makes me a worse human. So I have to balance that out. It actually might just be web standards. My partner will call me out and say, have you been working on web standards recently? I'm like, yeah, why? Like, because you're being really pedantic. She uses some swearing when she says that, but she's right that because you're working in an environment where all ambiguity must be destroyed, and I find myself taking that into the real world too much, and it's something that I'm making a real conscious effort to try and avoid. And I think in general, if you get trapped in code too much, you can end up forgetting about the humans behind it as well. So that's something I've been trying to fix in my personal habits.
Yeah, back in my university days, I did a 2-year course on computer science. I think we started with C++ and Java. I was terrible. I was shocking. And after I think it was the first semester in second year, I vowed never to do any practical stuff ever again, because I don't know what I did. I spent 3 or 4 days on this tiny project to deliver it on a Friday. I came to some friends, oh my God, I did it. I managed to do it. Like, it took me 3 or 4 days. And they were like, that took me an hour. Like, why did it take you so long? and then I just gave it up. And then I suppose I just somehow ended back up here again, writing code. And I found that when I started writing code and I started adopting the sort of the ideology or the approaches about programming, I realized, wow, I actually need to step back from my programming approaches from my personal life, because they really don't gel well, especially when you start getting dogmatic and your pragmatism sort of goes out the window, which I suppose is a phase that developers generally have to go through in order to get some real perspective.
Yeah, and what you're speaking about before about hitting a wall with coding, or like finding yourself struggling more than other people. That happens to everyone. I remember the first time I tried to use Flash when I was at school, and I kind of clicked around the interface. I looked at some examples, and I decided, I really tried. I didn't get anywhere, and I decided this is beyond me. I will never be able to do this. And I went back to it 6 months later, and I don't know, something had changed, and I was like, oh, hang on, this little bit actually makes sense. And I found that little loose thread that I could start pulling to discover more. And I did the same with JavaScript. I tried to learn it. I didn't get anywhere. I did the same with reading web standards. I, hit a brick wall. I had to just go back to it later. I look at WebGL and think, I will never be able to know that. It's beyond me. But previous experience, if I give it a go and fail, I know I can just go back to it in 6 months, and maybe things will have changed. So it's always worth giving it another go with a bit of a break, Yeah,
these little moving parts that seem to fall into place. Jake, if you could recommend one book on programming, what would it be and why?
I don't know if I can read. I'm not a reader. I don't read. I don't even really read fiction, which makes me sound really uncultured. But it's the truth, unfortunately. MDN. Most of the stuff, my in for JavaScript was MDN. Well, actually, my first in was, it was at university. We didn't have the internet at university in the rooms, which just blows my mind to think of that these days. I think we were the final year at Middlesbrough without internet anyway. But I did go to the library and picked up a big book about JavaScript and kind of read that. And maybe it helped. It didn't feel like it did at the time, but it wasn't until I was, online and I was able to just start chewing through MDN. It was those guides continue to be useful to me. So yeah, throughout my career, MDN wins.
Who in the front-end world is doing work that's really inspiring?
So my kind of all-time award, I think I would give to Remy Sharp. Just through the amount of stuff he's done, the amount of time that I've been a fan of his. So I remember early on in my career, I was reading his blogs about playing JavaScript, about jQuery, and then he started full frontal FFconf in Brighton. I spoke at it in the first year, and I think I went to. I try and go to that conference whenever I can, and I've missed it the past 2 years, which I'm a little bit miserable about. But until then, I'd been to it every year. But that he continues to be a contributor to so many projects, like things like JSPin. I just find myself using that so much.
I agree.
But then things like NodeMon, like all of the libraries that he's done. The term polyfill, that's Remy Sharp's.
No way.
Yeah, so. But a few other names I really look up to Dominic Denicola and Arne van Kesteren in terms of web standards. Like Dominic works at Google. He does a lot of TC39 stuff, a lot of HTML stuff. The stream spec is his. For Arne van Kesteren, he does HTML spec stuff. It's kind of annoying that when people speak of the 10x developer, and I think that's sort of been debunked. I don't know. When I see them two, just the amount of work they get done, I'm convinced they are hiring a team to work under their names, because every time I end up working on a new spec, I will find comments by one or both of them helping fix things and stuff. So the amount they know about the platform, I'm really envious of. But I'd also say. In terms of Sarah Drasner, I really look up to her work in terms of like developer outreach, but also the creative coding stuff. There aren't many people who can do the coding side to such a high level, or such an advanced level, but also the creativity side. And I hate people who can do that, because I can't. So I hate Sarah Drasner for being good at that. Paul Lewis, same. I hate him as well. People who can design and develop, they disgust me. It's just plain unfair. It shouldn't be allowed.
It's just inhuman.
Yeah, they should have to pick one and just let the other skill rot. It's just to give the aggressive as a chance.
I think we need some good communism rule on what we're allowed to do and not to do in terms of development and design, because it's just unfair. It's just unfair.
Give the rest of us a chance.
All right, Jake, let's reverse things a little bit over here. Imagine you wake up and you have no recollection of ever writing code. With your knowledge of the tools, books, and courses available today, how would you go about learning to program from scratch?
Well, like I said before, MDN was really how I got into it and how I continue to get into it. So that would be a huge part of it. I am a huge fan of Glitch right now, glitch.com. Being able to experiment with server-side stuff and just be able to share those demos instantly, that's one of those things of like, where have you been all my life? Because I mean, JSBin like just opened up so much to being able to just throw a quick demo online, and raw Git as well, a similar one. But if you needed to, like, I want to quickly test what happens if you send, like, if the server sends this header back, or what if it, breaks the connection halfway through? And these are things you can't do with a static thing like JSBin, like raw Git. So I spend so much time in Glitch these days, and if I forgot everything, I think that would be where I would go to start tinkering around without having to set up my own server and stuff. But I guess this might be twisting your question a bit, but I would go and read my own blog, and I don't mean that as a piece of self-promotion. Well, I probably do, but I try, and when I learn something, when I kind of have an epiphany or figure something out, I try and blog about it. So to some degree, it's like a backup of my brain. So if I did forget my everything, I think that's a point I would try and restore a lot of stuff. If I've already brain dumped there, I can kind of reapply it back to my brain, and hopefully, because I've written it, hopefully I would be able to understand it. I don't know if that would be true.
That's awesome.
But it's certainly somewhere I would go.
I suppose in this situation, it would be a severe case of amnesia as opposed to never having written code.
Yes, exactly.
All right, Jake, let's wrap up with your top tip on how to work smart and the best way to connect with you.
the best way to work smart, I think, don't forget the humans. That's sort of quite a general statement. Like, don't forget, I guess by that I mean don't forget users, and things like the kind of connectivity they might have, the different situations they might be in. But also don't forget that the person you're communicating with over the internet is a human as well, and it's over Twitter, the home of reasonable debate. It's quite it's quite easy to forget that it is like a normal human being at the other end who might not be as bad intentioned as you think.
That's becoming questionable nowadays. I don't know. All the AI coming out, who knows what you're talking to?
so I wrote this article on what was it on? It was like on async functions and the difference between await and return await. Anyway, it was someone posted it to Reddit, and there was some comments there, and there was a really interesting comment that dealt with some potentially interesting issues around call stacks and things like that. But the person's username was Adolf Hitler, and I didn't know how to what do I do with this person? Like, do I engage because their point is genuinely interesting? I didn't think their point was true or relevant, but I wanted to kind of talk to him. But do I want to talk to Adolf Hitler? I don't know if I do.
What's that? Is it Gordon's law, where every conversation will at some point eventually
descends into Nazism, a reference to Nazis?
Yes. Yeah. Well, you're just starting off on the wrong foot there.
Yeah, just going all in straight away. So I did respond in the end, and we had a bit of back and forth, and. It turns out he turned out to be entirely unreasonable, which I should have expected, really. Turns out Adolf Hitler, quite an unreasonable person, even on Reddit. So,
oh wow, okay,
that's what I learned.
Well, at least they were consistent.
Yes, exactly. True to name, I would say.
All right, and the best way to connect with you, Jake?
I'm Jaffa the Cake on Twitter. I spend too much time on Twitter, but also, my blog is jakearchibald.com, and that has links to like Twitter. It also has my email address, which is jaffthecake@gmail.com or jakearchibald@google.com. I don't mind which anyone uses. I think I'm Jake Archibald on GitHub. I don't know. There's all the links are on my blog.
Awesome. To everyone out there, you have been listening to Jake Archibald and Larry Buerter. Head over to fixate.it, where you'll find links and timestamps for everything we've been chatting about today. And Jake, thank you for sharing your journey with Fixate on Code. Keep pushing the limits and keep pushing great code.